Hello, this is John Baugh again, your professor for CIS 2555. We're starting on Chapter 1 after our brief introduction to C# last week. This week we're going to talk a little bit about ASP.NET programming. So, the objectives are to describe components of a web application, describe the four components of a uniform resource locator, and describe what happens when you omit the file name from a URL when you request a web page. Distinguish between static and dynamic web pages with the focus on the web server, application server, and database server. Distinguish between the internet and an intranet. Describe these terms: HTTP request, response, and round trip. We'll talk about web forms in ASP and also the new MVC applications in ASP. Describe the three types of environments that can be used for developing ASP.NET applications. List the software components that you need on your own PC if you want to develop and run ASP.NET in standalone, including database applications. We'll describe a little bit. One second. There we go. Sorry. Plenty of memory, don't know why it does that. Okay, so describe the class libraries and common language runtime of the .NET framework. Distinguish between the ASPX files and code behind files in an ASP.NET web application. So, this is Chapter 1. You'll notice on the syllabus that we are covering Chapters 1 and 2 today. Just doing a brief introduction of ASP.NET and how to develop a one-page web application. So, this right here, I will also direct you to pages in the book occasionally as well. You'll note that on page 4 and 5 they give you kind of a brief overview of different types of applications. So we'll look at this shopping cart application, which is one of the examples they show. This is the order page. You'll notice there's things such as a drop-down menu, and then there's a value here which is dynamically generated, and also the name generated by whatever they select in the list down here. So all this information is based on what's displayed in the list, and then a quantity right here. So you can click to add to cart or go to cart. So interacting using the buttons is another thing that you'll be able to do with a web application. The cart page could look like something like this, where in your cart you have a list box which lists each of the items and quantities, as well as the price, and then you can remove, empty the cart, check out, or continue shopping. So a dynamic web page is just that. We'll focus on that in this class. This isn't static web pages that we're concerned with as much as dynamic. So the components of a web application. The components of the web application consist of the clients, which are things such as the computer, tablet, a smartphone, multiple computers, tablets, smartphones, that interact through the internet with the web server. So the clients will access these web pages typically through programs known as web browsers, and you're probably familiar with a bunch of web browsers such as Internet Explorer, Chrome, Firefox, Opera, Safari. These are all different types of web browsers. The web server itself holds the files that make up the pages of a web application. A network is any general network, including the internet. But any network is a system that allows clients and servers to communicate. And even when you set up a web server, for example, it serves files over some sort of network. The internet is the world's largest network, and it consists of many other smaller networks. That's why it's called an internet. Now, you can have an internet, which would be a lowercase I. That would indicate that it's a bunch of networks connected together, but the internet is the worldwide internetwork of all the different networks in the world that are connected. So if you refer to the internet, you would capitalize the I in internet. So if you're writing a report or describing something in an email, remember to capitalize I in internet. These are the components of a URL, in a URL you have the protocol and the domain name, the path, and the file name. So these are useful to understand that a protocol is just a fancy word for rules. So there are different types of protocol. HTTP is what we call an application level protocol. If you've had networking classes, you know there are different levels on the OSI protocol stack or TCP/IP stack. These models, OSI model says that HTTP would be in the application layer. And this is a web domain name right here. This is the path, part of the path. So this would be like a directory or a folder on the website, and then this is a particular file name. Since this file is HTML, we know that it's a static HTML file. It could also be .htm as well. Static files do not change unless the developer changes them. So this is a static page on Muroc's website. You'll notice that it just has information about a book and some download information, save 30% off. These are all static. You'll notice it's .htm though if you look at the URL. So how does a static web page get served to the user? Well, a static web page is stored in HTML files or HTM files on the web server. When the client wants to receive that page or clicks on a link that indicates that they want to receive the page, they send an HTTP request to the web server, which has the HTML files, and then the web server sends back the HTTP response, which includes the hypertext markup language files that were requested. So the HTML files are then interpreted by the user's browser, and then the users can view the web page. Now, what we're more focused on in this particular class is dynamic web pages. Dynamic web pages, like the ones in the one in this figure, you can kind of tell it's dynamic because you've got a .aspx extension. You'll also see other extensions like .py and .php and others that indicate that they are not just plain old HTML files. Now, ultimately, the browser is only going to understand HTML, CSS, and JavaScript and things like that, and the new inclusions in HTML5. But as far as dynamic web interaction with the server, you have to have an ASPX site or ASPX page in order to do that. ASPX or PHP or something such as that. You'll notice that when they select a product, such as the Michael Myers head here for the Halloween Superstore, if you select this, it automatically prints the name and information about it and the price. If you indicate the quantity and add it to cart, it will contact the web server, and then it will store that information, and then when you go to the cart, it'll retrieve the information for you as well. Now, dynamic web pages are a little bit different how a web server processes them. Well, the web server, even though in a diagram you have to be very careful here, because in a diagram you'll note that they'll show stuff and they'll call it a server. This does not necessarily mean that these three are separate hardware. It does not necessarily mean they're on three separate computers. So they may all be on the same physical computer. The server often refers to the physical hardware, but in this case it could refer to just the software, and that's exactly what they're talking about here. They're saying that we have a web server, IIS, which is the Microsoft web server, and then the application server is ASP.NET in this case, and then you have a database server as well. So when the user requests a web page, they send an HTTP request just as usual and get an HTTP response ultimately with HTML. They send the HTTP request though to the web server. Then the web server, if it's dynamic, will contact the application server, such as ASP.NET. That will generate a page and send it back. If it has to grab more information from, say, a user database or a product database like Amazon would do, it'll contact the database server and then in turn get information back, store it in an HTML format, and then send it back to the web server, which then sends it back to the user. So this is a little bit of a different workflow here than you have with the static web page. There are two main ASP.NET technologies that we will discuss. Primarily in this book, you will talk about ASP.NET Web Forms. These were introduced in 2002, and they were a replacement for active server pages, which is now called Classic ASP. When I did my senior design, well, actually, it wasn't a senior design project. It was for a company when I was in school. We did a project for a library at a community college, strangely, that did some peer review systems in it, and it used ASP, Classic ASP 3.0, and that was before the .NET really took hold. So in ASP.NET updated a lot of this stuff, and these web forms were introduced as a replacement for just hand coding all of the ASP. In contrast to the active server pages or classic ASP, ASP.NET web forms let you work with a design model like the one for Windows Forms. So if you've used Visual Basic or C# before, which it would be very good that you have if you're taking this course, then you'll probably be familiar with the fact that you have Windows Forms that you can plop buttons down on and then double click them to generate event handlers and things like that. The primary focus of ASP.NET is a rapid application development, also called a rapid prototyping environment. So this is RAD development. ASP accomplishes this by letting web developers work with server controls on a design surface, and then you can create the code behind files that work with the design surface. So if you click on a button, for example, it will actually invoke methods that are on the in the code behind file. 70% or more of the ASP.NET development is done with web forms, so that's why the book focuses on them. However, in recent years, Microsoft has introduced MVC. Near the end of the book, they discuss MVC. We may get to it or may not actually get to this, but it would be a good thing to review right before, say going for a job interview. It might be a good thing to kind of play around with the technology, even if we don't get to it in this class. But you'll be well prepared to work with any of that. There are three other technologies that we're not going to discuss during the class, but just be aware. These are a little bit more esoteric. They do a little bit different things than what we're really interested in right now. And once you learn web forms, and especially once you learn a little bit about MVC, you'll be able to take these on as well. One other thing about MVC before we go on is that MVC is very dedicated to what's called separation of concerns, which refers to breaking an application into components, so each one deals with a single concern. Now, MVC is what we call an architectural design pattern, an architectural pattern. It's model view controller. It's part of a very large subfield within software engineering called design patterns, or design and architectural patterns for software. MVC is mostly concerned with separating the model, which is the data and stuff behind the scenes, how everything's implemented. The code behind file could be considered mostly part of the model or largely part of the model. Database. The view is what the user sees directly, so they're interacting with the design. They don't really care about what's going on behind the scenes as long as they get their data quickly and accurately. The controller is the part between the model and the view that delivers information back and forth between the two, essentially. Now, this is oversimplifying it significantly, but it gives you an idea. There are different editions of Visual Studio 2012 that you should be aware of. They go over them on page 14 and 15 a little bit. I'm sorry. Yeah, they do. They go over them a little bit on page 14 and 15. The Express edition would be adequate for the course if you need to download that, but I would recommend, since I've added all of you to DreamSpark, you go to DreamSpark, download the ISO file through the downloader, follow the instructions, and burn the ISO file to a DVD, and then you can plop the DVD right back into the machine, and it'll think it's an install disk, because it really is at that point. An ISO file is just an image disk, really. We'll be using, or I'll be using, Visual Studio Professional, but any of these really should work. Professional is good. Premium is usually when you're working with larger groups, and Ultimate is when you're working with very complicated groups and need a lot of special software features. The free edition and other editions includes things such as CIS Express and the SQL Server Express Local DB. The professional editions has a few more things in this, but they all have CIS Express. As a note, they also contain the ASP development server as an alternative to CIS Express, but it is not nearly as stable nor as quick. So as we go along, just keep that in mind. There is a very easy way to convert a ASP development server, which is the default. If you download, say, my examples that I'll post, if you download an example and extract the zip file and then create a quote or open a web page from it, it'll think it's being served by the development server. So you can tell it very easily, hey, I want you to use CIS Express. So that would be a good move on your part. So what are the development environments? The one we'll use pretty much exclusively is the standalone environment, which includes Windows 7 or later, .NET Framework 4.5, Visual Studio 2012, the IIS server, and SQL Server. So all you need on your PC is Windows 7 or later. All of the systems at all the different campuses are equipped with this, but hopefully you have it at home. .NET Framework 4.5, that's can be included or downloaded fairly easy. Visual Studio 2012, IIS Express, and then SQL Server Express Local DB for when we start doing database. Other examples or other possible development environments are the intranet development. Intranet means usually within a single organization in a LAN. So you might have a client connected to a server on a different machine, for example. And you essentially need the same stuff. When you're actually deploying a product, you will do a lot of internet development as well. You have the Windows 7 or later with the .NET Framework connecting over the internet to a server. The server should have not the IIS Express, but an IIS 7 FTP server and an SQL server on this side. And it usually is running a Windows Server version because they're made for serving. The .NET Framework is something you should be relatively familiar with. The .NET Framework is divided into multiple components, and it is these are at least the major components that consist of the class library and the common language runtime. Your .NET applications at the top, which include web applications, are developed in languages such as Visual Basic, Visual C#, Visual C++, and Visual F#. We're obviously going to focus on C#. If you're doing Visual Basic, that should be adequate, but I would recommend doing your applications in Visual C#. Once you learn them in C#, you can, and you're familiar with ASP, you can pick up the Visual Basic quite easily. So the .NET applications themselves that you write up here, these would be the actual web applications, for example, use the services of the .NET Framework that are in here. Again, this is a model. It simplifies the .NET Framework so you can understand it better. The .NET Framework, in turn, basically black boxes or masks the operating system and underlying hardware, so you don't need to worry about the details. .NET Framework takes care of a lot of these details, or the majority of these details, for you. The class library itself provides pre-written code in the form of classes that are available to all of these different languages. And then the Common Language Runtime, or CLR, manages the actual execution of .NET programs and coordinates essential functions such as memory management and security. So languages like Visual C# are managed. So that means just like Java has automatic garbage collection in it, your C# programs will as well. All these .NET languages compile ultimately into Microsoft Intermediate Language, which is called IL. It's kind of like Java bytecode, and they're stored in what's called an assembly. And then the assembly is run by the common language runtime on the native system. So we need to talk a little bit about state, tracking state in a web application here. Why is state difficult to track in a web application? Well, HTTP is what we call a stateless protocol. So that means that it does not maintain the state of the application. And what do we mean by state? Well, very simply, you might have heard this millions and millions of times in your programming classes, but never had really a formal definition or a real solid idea what it was. It's really not super difficult. It basically just means like the values in the various variables that are being tracked. HTTP does not natively store the state of these applications. So what happens is that you send out the first request, and then the response comes back from the server. The next time an HTTP request is made to the web server, the browser requests another page. The server has no way to associate the browser with its previous request. So by default, HTTP, well, anytime, HTTP itself does not manage any of that. It cannot track state. So there are 5 ASP.NET features for maintaining state. ASP.NET does allow you to maintain the state and overcomes the difficulties as an overlay on HTTP. ASP is able to take care of this stuff. We'll talk about view state a little bit in Chapter 2, and then Chapter 8 also talks about it extensively. You'll notice 8 is big on maintaining state. I believe we cover Chapter 8 I think it's in a few weeks. Let's see when. I'm pretty sure we cover it though. Yeah, Chapter 8, when you get your program assignment 2 in early March, we'll talk about state cookies and URL encoding just before the midterm. So we will go over this a little more extensively, but for right now, and in Chapter 2, they'll give you a little bit more information about it. The two that you'll use most of the time are view state and session state. Okay, so view state's implemented by default, so there's no special coding that's needed. ASP takes care of it automatically. Session state is implemented by creating a session state object. It's when the user starts a new session. The values in the object are available until the session ends, and then we'll talk about the other ones later. There is an application that they play around with a lot in this, or that they demonstrate a lot in this first couple chapters of the book. It's called the future value application. It basically is a 401 future value calculator. So if you say my monthly investment is this amount with an annual interest rate of this over a number of years, it'll tell you how much money you'll get out of it. So you can hit calculate or clear. You'll note that in ASP.NET, pages like this are called web forms. So by default, we call them web forms. To make these pages work, each form contains ASP.NET server controls. Okay, so server controls. You've got drop-down menu, you've got text boxes, you've got a label right here, and then you've got buttons near the bottom. Those are all server controls. The processing for the calculate and clear buttons is done on the server. So that means that when either button is clicked, the calculate or clear, then the form is submitted to the server, and then the C#, which will be on the server in what we call the code behind file, will process the data from the form, and then the form is returned to the browser. In other words, each time you click a button, it leads to a round trip. Okay, so by round trip we mean, going back here, HTTP request, HTTP response. Okay, so that's one round trip. In some cases, though, the form isn't submitted to the browser when the calculate button is clicked. So that happens when JavaScript is enabled in the user's browser, and one or more entries are invalid. So the JavaScript code that's been generated from the validation controls, we'll talk about those also in today's lesson. The JavaScript code that's been generated will actually detect invalid entries. And remember, JavaScript, at least in this context, is a client-side technology. So JavaScript will be implemented client-side. So what will happen is that if it detects, as JavaScript detects invalid information here, for example, the user doesn't put the number of years and hits calculate, it will not do a round trip. It will just locally from the client side say, hey, wait, you didn't do that, so interest rate must be from 1 to 20, so that's the first thing, and then number of years required, there's another one they missed. So this will prevent it from having to do a round trip in that case. Now, the server side will still validate it even if it gets past the client side, but this is one way to avoid the full round trip. If the user does not have JavaScript enabled in their browser, then this will go to the server anyway and be validated over there. So you don't get the advantage of not having a round trip in that case, but it's still validated. This is what future value form and design view of Visual Studio will look like. We'll check it out a little bit in Chapter 2. But you see that there's the Mirac logo in the corner, some information here, and then the web server controls over here, and some text, some buttons, and then validation control involved as well. So the files in the future value application include something called Default.aspx. When you create an application, you'll note that it'll create a Default.aspx and a Default.aspx.cs. The Default.aspx file is the file that contains the code that represents the design of the form. The ASPX, we refer to this typically as ASPX code. It consists of standard HTML code plus ASP tags that define the server controls. The ASPX.cs file, this one right here, we refer to as the code behind file. That contains C# code. Notice the .cs extension. If it was in VB and we were doing ASP, it would have a .aspx.vb extension. So this code behind file contains all of the code that processes the data from forms and that are sent to the web server. The third file, web.config, contains configuration information like which version of .NET is being used. And then finally you have this file, the JPEG file, that's just the logo that's put at the top. You could have multiple images, obviously. So this shows you a little bit about the code here. This is the ASPX file, remember, that contains the server controls and also HTML itself. So you'll notice that at the very top you have what's called a page directive, and it says code file. This indicates the code behind file right here, and this code behind file is the file that will have the C#. Other things to notice is that for ASP you have to have run at server on the form. That indicates that the form will be processed at the server, and then each of these is server control. So you have a drop-down list. Notice it's prepended with ASP : drop-down list, has an ID, a width, a run at server directive, and other information. Same thing down here. You've got the text box and label right here, and the two buttons. The buttons are very special, though. If you'll note, the buttons actually have event handlers set. So on click, it says equal btn calculate underscore click. Well, that's the name of the method on the server that's going to be called if the user clicks this button, btn calculate. Btn click, clear click is what will be called on the server if the user clicks the clear button. You'll notice one difference between these two buttons is that clear has causes validation set to false. So what that means is that the attribute itself, I guess the attribute itself causes validation, tells the page whether to fire the validation event that are used by the validation controls. If you set it to false, that means that the data validation will do their work when you click calculate, but not when you click clear, because this is set to false here. The one on the calculate, by default, it's true. So that means when you click this button, it'll perform validation checks on anything you set it to. Now, that was the ASPX file. That was what we call the ASPX code. The ASPX.cs file is the code behind file. This, you'll notice, is very different. it is C# code instead of just HTML and the web form. See, the code here involves tags. This is the ASPX file. In the ASPX.cs file, you have C#. Notice, C# delimits methods and other things like classes with curly braces. So if you're coming from Visual Basic, you don't use the terms like end sub and things like that. You have curly braces, which account for a block. If statements optionally have curly braces, if you don't put curly braces, it only applies to the immediate line underneath. And then same thing for for loops and while loops, do while loops. It'll only affect the object underneath, or not the object, but the statement underneath. It only applies to the statement underneath. So first thing to note that's a little bit specific to ASP that you may not have seen even if you've had C# is this isPostBack property. The isPostBack, if it's set to false, this means that's the first time the page has been loaded. So if you subsequently call it, then isPostBack will be true. So the first time you load the page, isPostBack is false. Not, which is in front of it, not isPostBack negates it, so it reverses its truth value, makes that true. So that means if it's the first time that you've loaded the page, it's going to execute this loop here and add the items from going by increments of 50 up to 500 to this list, monthly investment. So they're allowing you to invest 50 all the way up to 500 per month. So that's what postback does. It says, is this essentially, is this a postback? Is this a subsequent call? If it's not a postback, then it is the initial time the page has loaded. IsValid is another property. You do not declare isValid. It is in the system. This is the data valid, asks the question, is the data valid in the server controls? This is set by the validation controls. Each of them has their own isValid property, and if they're all valid, then it sets the overall web form isValid property to true. So if it is valid, we do this, otherwise you ignore it. So, and let the validation controls give errors. Okay, so you've got calculate future value. This is the a protected method that actually calculates the value. So you've got the information being passed in here, and then it goes through and it actually returns the future value ultimately. So pay very close attention to the syntax, especially if you're not familiar with C#. And you notice that you have btn clear click here, and you've got the btn calculate click above it that we saw earlier. Notice that this actually calls calculate future value. Now the this appended here with the period, that's actually optional, so you don't really have to worry about that if it's in the same file, and you only have one with this name. But that makes use of calculate future value, which acts as a helper method. So this right here, btn clear click and btn calculate click, are both event handlers. So they're methods. They have the signature with object sender and event args e. Both of them do, if you'll notice. Object sender, event args e. And you notice back in here, if we go back to the ASP file, you'll notice that on click for the button here is set to btn calculate underscore click, and for the other button, the btn clear button, it's btn clear underscore click. So these two buttons are associated with this C# event handler. This is where they're wired in, essentially. So that's all you need for chapter 1, essentially. I would read through it if I were you, and then I will come back in just a second. You won't notice much of a difference. If you want to go take a break for a few minutes, that might be good, and I'll come back and start on chapter 2. So take about a 10-minute break, 5-minute break, whatever you need. And the cool thing about online classes is you can pause me whenever you want. Isn't that great? All right, talk to you in a bit. All right, so we'll get going into the chapter 2 material. One thing I'd like to note is that on Desire to Learn, there's the future value zip file that you can download. You need to extract it into a folder so that you get this. It may be 2 layers. It might say chapter 02 future value. You double click, it's done again. But the one that contains the images folder, default files, and the web config file is the one that you're going to treat as the application, or as the web application itself. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to open up Visual Studio here, and I'm going to go to File, Open, Website. So File, Open, Website in this case. And we're going to take a look at the future value application. So there's local IIS sites, and then you've got the file system as well. You can always open them. We're going to talk about it, then we're going to make a fresh one, then we're going to go back and talk about this one. But for now, I've got the site here. You will go into it by clicking the top level of the site and clicking open. That will open up. This is a website. You'll notice that there's the Default.aspx. If I double click that, it should open the web form if I give it a couple minutes. Okay, so down here you'll notice at the very bottom, you'll notice there's design, split, and source. If I click on design, it will show me the design view of the website. So here you go. You got the image up at the top, which you can just insert. They made an images folder. To create a new folder, you can right click the project and go to add new folder right here, and then you can name it whatever you need it to be named. You can right click that, the folder that you made, and then go to add existing item, and then go searching for the images or whatever else you need in the folder. It's just to help keep organized. So as you can see, they've added from the toolbox, they've added a drop-down list right here, which can be created from this. You just put the cursor where you want it and then double click, or you can click and drag it where you want it. You'll notice they've added a table here as well. So we'll talk about some of this other stuff as well. You've got the 2 text boxes. This is just text, okay? And then this right here is a label because it'll receive output. Calculate button and clear button. Okay, so I'm going to close this just for now. I'll save changes, click yes. And let me see here. Yeah. No, you know what? We'll close it and I'll say no. We'll do it again in just a second. I'm going to open up Visual Studio here, and we're going to create a new web application just to show you some of the functionality. We go to File, New, Website. So you create a new website. And the one we'll be working with extensively is the ASP.NET empty website. So I've got this. You have to pick a location down here. I'm going to go in my file system, and where I'm going to keep it is a different location. What do we got here? OCC, CIS 255. I'm going to put it under my working directory, and then I'm also going to put a backslash and then the name of the file. So I'm just going to call it, we'll call it ch2 examples, example 1. Okay, so I'm going to hit open, and it's going to say that folder does not exist. Do you want to create it? You say yes, and when you create it, it'll create the folder. You've got ASP empty website. Hit OK. And now you've got an empty website. So it just has a web.config file. That's all it's got. It just tells basically what's the .NET framework, the target, and a little bit of information, and the version of XML. So there's very little configuration at this point. To add a web form, you have to right-click the project, go to Add, New Item. You could also go directly to Web Form, but I usually go to Add New Item just to bring up the options while demonstrating. So you'll notice there's the web form. Default.aspx is the default page that it looks at. It's kind of like index.html. So the default.aspx and the default.aspx.cs are the initial files by default. Make sure it says place code in separate file. So that means place the C# code and everything in a separate file, and click Add. So you click Add and it gives you this ASPX file right here. If I go to Split View, that shows me both the design and the code, the ASPX code. And then if I go to Design, it just shows me the design portion. In the source, you can put anything you want, essentially. I'll go back to Design because I want to show you that. I'm going to go to Toolbox over here. And again, if you don't see the toolbox, you can go to View Toolbox and then put it wherever you want it. In the book, they typically keep the toolbox on the left side, but you can click and drag it and dock it wherever you want it. So inside the body, there's a div tag, you'll notice, and if I go to split here, you'll notice if I highlight the div tag, it'll highlight that. If I highlight the form, it'll highlight the form. If I highlight the body, it'll highlight the body. Okay, so you should have at least basic HTML understanding. Probably, I think all of you have taken 1400 or should have. You can put the title up in here. I'll call this my test page. Okay, I'll hit save. When you hit save, they go back in sync. In the body down here, you could put a button. I can put a button there, or actually you can put it in the code and it will generate the code for you. But when I put the button right here, you'll notice that it will automatically generate the server control right here. ASP button, it'll give it an ID, tell it run at, and then the text on it. Now typically, although you could edit the properties or the attributes in this case over here, typically you want to go to the properties menu. Or I'm sorry, the properties window. And down here I'm going to change the text. The text property is the stuff that's visible to the user. It's what's actually on the button in this case. For a label, it would be what's on the label. You can access the stuff programmatically in the program or do it at compile time or design time right here. So the text I'm going to put click me. Alright. And then I'm going to change the name of the button. It's usually a good idea to change it to something a little more useful. So I'm going to call it BTN. That's standard. The ID property right here is the same as the name property in Windows Forms application. So ID and name are essentially the same thing. So I'm going to call it BTN click me. It's conventional to put BTN in front of buttons, LBL in front of labels, etc., but it is not a requirement of the language. You can name it something, just name it something useful. You can call it click me button or something like that, but usually it's a good idea to put the 3-letter or 2-letter prepending right here, starting with a lowercase, since it's a variable name. So I've got BTN click me. If I hit enter over here, you'll notice it will add a break in the code, so it's generating the code as I go along. And right underneath, I'm going to hit enter, and then I'm going to put a label. So I'm going to take a label from over here and plop it down right here in Design View, and it'll generate the code for the label with an additional break here because I put an additional break there. The label, initially I'm going to delete the text, so the text is empty, and then the name I'm going to put LBL output. Alright, so I've got the BTN click me and the LBL output. And remember, this is the ASPX file. If we go under Solution Explorer, you can see that we've got Default.aspx, and then the code behind file is visible if you expand the Default.aspx here. You've got the code behind file, which currently has nothing of really any mention right yet. If I go here, though, and I want, for example, when the user clicks this button for it to update whatever's in the label, then I'm going to go into the Design View and double-click this button, and it will automatically take me to the ASPX.cs code behind file, and it generates the event handler right here. I can look back at the code, and you'll notice the button that I have here now has an onClick attribute, and that is pointing to btn click me underscore click. Well, what does that name mean? Well, it's the btn click me underscore click method right here. This is the event handler for clicking the click me button, right? So in there, what do I want to do? I want to take the label. I'll use IntelliSense here. I'm going to take the label and set its text equal to you clicked the button. Notice in C# there's a semicolon required at the end of statements, so please keep that in mind. It's very similar to Java in that respect. And we set the text property, which I'm going to save it, save this too. We set the text property that I deleted entirely right here. You can access it not just in the properties window, but also in the program itself. So I'm setting it, as soon as I click that button, this event handler will get fired from the click event being raised, and will cause the label's text to put "you clicked the button" inside of there. So let's build it, make sure it's succeeded. Then I'm going to start without debugging. When you start without debugging, it's going to open it in the default browser, and you notice right here it says localhost, waiting for localhost. Internet settings are turned off by default. That's fine. Okay, so I click me, and it'll automatically generate this code. You clicked the button, right? So when I click the button, it sends a signal to the server. The server processes it in the C# and then sends back this right here. You clicked the button. So you'll notice the name of the project here does not look like a file system. It just says the name of the project. So that's how we know that it's running through CIS. If you directly download my code, you'll notice that it will say a full path name, okay, which we'll see in a second. And you'll notice if I right click here, I could tell it to use the development server, or I could go back once I use development server and change it back to CIS. So remember, we talked about the different options you have for running it. Typically we want to run it in CIS. The development server is a little bit quirky, it's slower, and it's not as good for testing either. So we've seen a little bit of what we can do here. Well, let's see if we can do something a little bit different. Well, inside of the partial class, I'm going to make a private static variable. Static variables are owned by the class, not an individual instance, so this one will stay alive during the session. Public static int num clicks equals 0. So I'm initializing this integer. Notice I'm doing it at the level of the class, not inside of a method, although I could. This right here is what we would call a field. Okay, it's a static field of the class. Inside of here, I'm going to say num clicks plus plus. That's equivalent to num clicks equals num clicks plus 1, right? It's equivalent. And I'm going to say you click the button space, and then put num clicks times. Okay, so I'm concatenating this number in between the strings, so it's going to tell you how many times you click the button. I'm going to build it again, and I'm going to start without debugging. I'm going to click it. It says 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and it'll keep going. So that keeps the ASP is responsible for maintaining the state of that variable, the static variable. So you notice I can keep clicking it. It'll keep sending something to the server, sending a request, HTTP request to the server, and the server responds with the page while maintaining the basics of the state. So pretty useful. You'll notice also it says my test page at the top because that's what I set the title to. You can tell it to open it in a different browser by changing this little arrow up here and setting the default browser. So if I wanted to open it in Chrome or Firefox or something else, you would set it here. Anything you've got installed, it'll pick up. Opera, so on and so forth. All right, so let's go over the slides a little bit. We're not going to, go over every little detail. There are a lot of slides, and some of it you can just go over in the book. So I'm just giving you a brief overview and what you're capable of, or what you'll be able to do in this chapter. So this chapter is all about how to develop a single page or one-page web application. So we'll skip the objectives. You can read them yourself. To create a new page, I already showed you that. You go to File, New, Web Page, or in the Express Edition, it's just File, New Web Page. New Web Page is a single option. You want to generally keep it as ASP.NET empty website. When you become more adept at it, you might eventually want to change it to a web form site or one of the other options, depending on what you're creating. So there are distinctions. There's web applications which are taken by going under File, New Project. That's a little bit different. We will deal with sites because it's easier to edit the files individually and maintain everything, whereas an application is pre-compiled to a single assembly which you upload or deploy. We're going to stick with a site because it's more natural, it lends better to the file system, etc. 3 web location options for ASP.NET websites. You've got file system, HTTP, and FTP. When you right click the option, we're typically dealing with a file system, which we picked at the very beginning. You're going to have an empty website like we had before, and you just right click here and go to add new item. Okay, so that gives you access to the new web form that you create. Since it's empty, it doesn't have any web forms by default. So this tells you how to do it, how to add a new web form to the project, etc. If you have a web form that's already usable and you like it, or maybe in another project, or someone else developed it for you and you want to put it in yours, you have to go to add existing item instead of add new item. Alright, so Designer and Source view in 3 other windows. You've got the source code window here, code editor for the source immediately available to you. It's got some features that look very similar to Dreamweaver if you've used Dreamweaver. The future value product as a new folder is being added, so if we want to add a new folder to here, we would right click, go to add new folder, and then you could just name it, say, images, if I want to put images in here, and then you can right click, add existing item, and then go searching for an image. Let's say I find an image under pictures. I want to let me see here, all files. Okay, so we want to add the koala, and then maybe I want to take this koala and put it somewhere in the page. So I'm just going to hit OK. That's a really big koala. So let me see here. Lower right hand corner, there are the handles of the image. You can make it whatever you need to do. Skew it, make it really small, whatever you need. So then I build it and run it, and it will have the angry koala here. I click me, you clicked it 1 time, 2 times, 3 times, 4 times, etc. And it'll have the different images, or the different values while the image is still there. So that's just different options you have. Okay, so you can put images, it's as easy as that. You'll notice that it will have created the image tag for you. You can create alternate text for it. That's usually used with visual or with screen readers, so people who are visually impaired can get information about the image. So if the image is anything but a background image or something that's just for decoration that doesn't really need to be described, if it is actually useful to the page and someone would need it, then you want to provide alternate text. It also shows if the page isn't loading fast, it'll show the alternate text as well in the browser. Okay, so continuing, got the Open Project dialog box. You can open the solutions file. Typically, we talked about split view and went over that already. Now, if you wanted to add a table to the form, you could go to Table, Insert Table. So you've got the let me see here. You got the page right here. If you click in Design View, it'll bring up the table option here. It's not available if you click in the code view, so you got to be in the design view. So I'm going to remove, or I'm going to move. I hit enter a couple times, and then I'm going to go to Table, Insert Table. It'll bring up an Insert Table dialog. Let's say we want 2 rows and 2 columns, and that'll give you those options, different options with it. So you can change the size also to your needs. So there's all kinds of different options with this that you can set for the access key and all these different options for the cells in the table, etc. So it'll tell you even that you're in a TD. It'll tell you what style is used, etc. So you can fill in information here, and then when you run it, it'll show the table. So I'm going to delete that just for now. Don't need the table, but you'll notice it generates the code automatically, so it's very, very useful. It keeps track of what's going on. You can resize the entire table by dragging the handle, so that's one thing to notice. And that shows you how to do all this stuff on slide 20, dealing with tables. How to add text to a table and format it. To add text to the table, you just type the text into the cell and then select it and use the controls in the formatting toolbar and commands in the format menu. So you've got the format menu up here. So it would pick up in context that you wanted to format the table. So we'll take a look at the future value application. So here's one thing I want to show you is you want to go to File, Close Solution. Once you've downloaded the future value application from Desire to Learn, it's a zip file. You have to right click the zip file and go to Extract All, and then you can get rid of the zip file itself. You will have a folder with the same name. So you notice here I've got Chapter 2 Future Value. It might be double layer, so you can finesse it and move it around and replace the outer layer if you want to, but just make sure that ultimately when you select the website, you're selecting the folder that contains the files that are already in there. So the images, default, Default.aspx, you've got the Miroc logo inside of images, etc. So you want to maintain the file structure. One other note is that when you download something, it will automatically import it as a file structure and will not use CIS by default. It will use the development server, ASP development server. So you want to change that. We'll check that in just a second. So I've showed you how to make a new project, a new website by going to File, New Website. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how to open up a website that you've already got created. So I'm going to go to File, Open, Website, and you're going to look for it. You might have to burrow down under the file system, burrow down into its location. So I've got the Chapter 2 Future Value. Make sure it's the right one. Yep, it has the images folder in it, so I know that's the right one. I'm going to hit Open. And you'll notice right now that the name of the project starts with C:/ and then it says etc. ... and then it eventually goes to Chapter 2 Future Value. That is a hint to you that it is using the development server and not CIS. It's very simple to change it to use CIS though. So I'm going to right click it and say down in this third section here, Use CIS Express. I click that, it'll say, do you want to configure the website to use CIS Express as the web server? A new site will be created on the CIS Express server and it will be reloaded in the solution. You want to click Yes, and it'll say has been sent to CIS, your website is hosted at ... So that gives you a port number and everything. So the website will now be reloaded. Hit OK. I open up Default, look at the design view, and I find my Miroc. If I run it here, I can build and then run it. Start without debugging here. If I hit calculate, it'll give me the value. If I'm missing values like this, I hit calculate, it'll say interest rates required. If I miss that, it'll say interest rates required, number of years required. So let's say 5 years and annual interest rate of 7. So I hit calculate, it'll complete it here and tell you the value. So it did contact the server. I can also clear it, and if I try to calculate it now, it'll give me an error because I don't have these fit or set. Okay, so let's look at this a little bit in detail. Couple properties you should be aware of. Auto postback causes validation. Enabled view state, enabled height ID. These are a lot of very useful properties that you might make use of. For example, visible is the thing visible at any given time. You can set that to true or false. It's Boolean. Text is the user visible value. ID is the programmatic name. Okay. When you have a drop-down list like we have here, you'll notice that one of its properties is named items. So this items collection there's nothing visible in here because it appears that the values are added programmatically. So let's look at the code. Let's see if we can see where it's added. If I look at the actual C# code, you'll notice that an event exists here called page load. The page load event occurs. The page load event occurs at the very beginning when the not surprising, when the page loads. And what we have here is not if not post back. So what that means is if this is the first time it's been loaded, then it's going to take each of these I values, convert it to a string, and add it to this list. This is the name of the drop-down list, which you have control over. You can actually name it up here in the ID, DD monthly investment, in the properties window. If I go back here, you'll notice that I say that dot items, and you might look at it and say, well, what does that mean? What is dot items? Well, items is the collection of the list item objects that represent the items in the control. Okay, so I'm going through here and I'm adding these elements here. If they click the calculate button, I do a validation check. This is set by the validation controls, which we'll see in just a minute. If they're valid, we do conversions on all of these values that are brought in. And then at the very end, if you want to, also notice we're calling calculate future value, so that actually, we broke that out into another method here. That makes it a lot easier. I'm not sure why they've got that code like that, but okay. So the for loop down here actually goes month by month and adds the future value in, or adds the interest in, and then at the very end it returns the value that it calculated. btn clear, not surprising, sets the selected index to 0 and then empties all of the text boxes. So pretty straightforward, most of this code, and you should be able to figure it out by reading through some of it. Validation controls are very important. A validation control is a type of ASP.NET control that's used to validate the input data. So right here, you'll notice that you have required field validators. That's a type of validator. It's under, in the toolbox, it's under, if you go to the ASP, there we go. You've got standard and then you've got validation down here. You can drag them over here. You'll notice that this says it's a range validator. That's a range validator, or required field validator. This one's a required field validator, and then this one's also a required field, a range validator. You set them using the control to validate. You have to associate it with one of the controls on the form. So once you do that, it will provide its validation. So if it is not, if it is required and you don't put it in there, you can just set the text, and if they did not fulfill this as a required field, it will display this right here. You can tell it what color to display it in and everything else. So I'd say play around with that, make sure you understand how that works. You take, basically you just drag one of these onto here and it will be invisible unless the exception or the error that it excuse me, that it is associated with is flagged or is raised. In other words, if it's a required field validator, which is one of the types, that means that if the user did not enter the information, it will cause this to show whatever its error message is. If it's a range validator, you just set a range. And oops, sorry, one second, let me click the range validator. There's a range validator. If you set the range validator, you have a maximum and a minimum value. If it does not fall within that range, it will automatically put the error message up. And if the user has JavaScript enabled, it will not send it to the server unless it's valid. So it's very, very useful. You should become familiar with these. Required field validator sets the properties that are used by all validators. There's control to validate. Display determines how the error message is displayed, and then the error message itself. you have to associate the validation control with a specific input control with the control to validate property. So again, I would insert one of these and then tell it control to validates this one. And since it's a required field validator, if they don't enter information for that one, it will cause the error to occur. Range validator has a few additional properties. You've got the, okay, for example, this one right here, a few additional properties such as the maximum and minimum value, which I showed you a second ago, and there's also type. Type is the data type that's used for range checking. So if you want it to fall in the range with doubles or what have you, so this one's validating the interest rate, for example, and the interest rate can be a double. This range right here, you'll notice, is using integer. That's because the range of years has to be an integer. It's a whole number. You're not putting like 10.5 or 4.6. So if they put 0 there, it's an error. If they put 46, it's an error. It has to be within range. So that's pretty useful. So this goes through how you add the validation. So I'd start at slide 28 and kind of look at it. Tells you a little more information. This is what the actual code looks for each of these controls. I'll take you to the code here. I've currently got it in design view, but if you go to source, you'll see that the required field validator, this is a server control. You've got the ID right here, where it's run at. Interest rate is required, text interest rate, dynamic, the for color, and then you'll notice with this one, you'll notice that the values and everything are set for the range validator, the values are set right here with minimum and maximum values. For the required field validator, since it's that type, you don't need to worry about max and min. That doesn't make sense. It's just, is it there or not? If it's not, it will cause the error right here. So these, again, it looks like HTML, but this is not actually HTML. It's kind of an XML. There are standard HTML tags in here as well, but you'll notice there's stuff that doesn't make sense either because it's an ASPX file. The stuff that's actually sent to the user will fully be HTML. So, because that's what browsers can understand. But as you're coding, you have to use some ASPX as well. A lot of this is done in design view, though. It just generates the code for you, but you can do it manually by typing it. There is unobtrusive validation mode. Unobtrusive validation is a new feature within ASP.NET 4.5. You should at least be aware of it. The feature controls how the client-side validation of the validations controls is done. So the two major settings are web forms. Web forms uses jQuery, and none will be the older method of generating JavaScript code. The benefit of using it, if you use jQuery for the unobtrusive validation, is that it reduces the amount of JavaScript that's generated. That's why ASP.NET enables unobtrusive validation by default. The problem with this is that if you start a website from the empty website template, unobtrusive validation is enabled, but the jQuery library and configuration needed are not there. So that means that if you try to use validation control, you'll get an error. There are two ways to fix this. Okay, so just be aware. One way is to add the component. To do that, you can use NuGet, which is a Visual Studio feature. We'll learn more about that later, but the other alternative is to disable unobtrusive validation. To do that, you just set the unobtrusive validation property to none in the load event handler for the page. So if I look at the event handler for the page, notice that unobtrusive validation mode is set to System Web UI unobtrusive validation mode none. So that will cause it to generate the regular old JavaScript. So if you start messing around with the unobtrusive validation or with validation controls and you start getting errors, just note that you just have to set this to none or use NuGet to install the jQuery components that you need. So for now, though, we'll just ignore the jQuery stuff and just use we won't use unobtrusive validation mode. Okay. They do show you how to do it here. So if you're interested, slide 35, how to install the NuGet packages, in which case you would not have to set the unobtrusive validation mode to none. All right. So this shows CSS right here. This is CSS that's been added, auto style 1 and auto style 2. It has to do with different auto styles applied in the code, which if you look through you'll be able to find more of it, such as the this right here where it says monthly investment in this cell. This is set to auto style 2, which is the width is 172 pixels. So it's a manually written CSS you're applying to it. And of course you've got the on-click options here, which will call code on the server. And then they show you the required field validators, range validators, etc., which we can see if we go here and look at the source code view. Here are the range validators and required field validators that we discussed not too long ago. All right. Code editor for a web form. We've dealt with the code editor. You'll notice that as you type stuff in the code editor, like we did earlier, that it brings up IntelliSense. So like feature value toString C, so .toString, I can just hit tab and then put C in there, finish it off, but it will finish off stuff for you if you just keep hitting tab. There are 3 ways to create an event handler in ASP. The 3 ways that you're going to use extensively, especially the first one, is just double clicking outside the body of the web form to start an event handler for the load page, double clicking on a specific control in design to start an event handler. So that one, the middle one's used very extensively. You can also select a control in the designer and then click the events button. So if, for example, if I wanted a non-default event, let's go back to the code here. Oops. In design view, if I want a non-default event, for example, for the calculate button, I could go over to the properties window, and the properties window, you'll notice there's what looks like a lightning bolt, and then you've got also properties and events, so you can go back and forth through events. There's other stuff here too, like click is the default event, but there's other stuff like when the button loads. Let's say I want it to do something special, maybe it picks up the name of the button on the fly. You can create an event here, type its name, or double click here to get the default name, or you can set it to a method that's already written. Okay, so there are multiple options here. To comment out portions of code, you can in the source code, for example in C, CS file, if I wanted to, for example, comment this out, I could do Control K, Control C, and it would comment it out. If I do it again, Control K, Control U for uncomment, it will uncomment it. So you can do that for multiple portions of code. It could be a huge amount of code that you can do Control K, Control C, Control K, Control U, instead of sitting there typing all the comments. So Control K puts it in a specific mode, the commenting mode. Think of K for comment, even though C is how you say comment. Control K puts you in that mode. If you hit Control K, Control C as a combination, not at the same time. You don't hit the K and the C at the same time. You have to separately hold down Control, tap the K, then tap the C. So that will comment the code that you have highlighted. If you do Control K U, it'll uncomment. So just keep that in mind. It's very, very handy. These are common page events: init, load, and pre-render. Init is called when the page is requested from the server. This event is raised before the view state of the page controls has been restored. So if there's anything you need to do before the state has been restored, the view state, then you would do it in the init event. Load is when the page is requested from the server and after all the controls have been initialized and the view state has been restored. This is the event you typically use to perform initialization operations. The pre-render is when all the control events for the page have been processed, but before the HTML is sent back to the browser is generated. So before the HTML is generated, if you have anything to do before that, then you call it in pre-render. Common control events, so the others were page events, so that has to do with the page itself. The common ASP.NET control events include things such as click, that's very common with buttons obviously, text changed, that's very common in text boxes, and then check changed and selected index change. So check change would work on radio buttons and check boxes, and selected index changed, that is very common for things like drop-down lists. Okay, so they show you the code for the future value form, which you'll be able to peruse on your own. To run the application, you can hit F5, or you can click on the various options. To stop an application, you can just do the close button in the upper right corner of the browser. You can click stop debugging if you're in debug mode as well. So right here you can change the particular browser that you're using. To fix syntax errors and exceptions, you go to the statement that caused the syntax error and double click it. So if I go back here, let's just say right here I forgot the semicolon. I'm going to save this, I'm going to go to build, and you'll notice it will not actually build it and get me ready to run it. I'll get an error list at the bottom. It says semicolon expected. I double click here, it'll take me directly to where it expects it, and then I just add the semicolon. That error is very simple. Some errors are a little bit more convoluted, but they usually point you at least into the area of where the problem occurred. Okay, so keep that in mind. To view the HTML for a page in the browser, you go to View Source. So let's look here. So we know that the ASPX code here is not, this right here isn't HTML itself. It does have information that it needs, but if I click to run it in Internet Explorer, it loads it in Internet Explorer, and I see the page. Now if I right click in the blank area of the page and go to View Source, it'll open it up and I can view the original source here. You notice that there's stuff like JavaScript that's been automatically generated that I didn't see in the ASPX code, but it's been automatically generated for me. There's some encrypted fields here. Then there's things like the select drop-down, which was generated on the fly the first time. It'll be restored by the view state if I request the page again. So every time I click a button or refresh the page, it will be generated from the original set instead of regenerated over and over again, because if it's a post back, you don't want to have to keep using, running that on the server. It's just a waste of energy essentially. Then you've got the required field validators down here. The display is set to none. They're not actually shown by default. Display is set to true if there is an error though. So this is pretty much it. You'll notice that this is all JavaScript, CSS, and actual HTML. So these are the validators. This is regular old HTML. This is not the code we saw in the ASPX server control, right? Okay, so show you some of the HTML. There's a quotation application I believe they talk about in the book. If you want to go through that, then that would be a good thing to practice with. You can look at the back. Make sure you look over the perspectives. The exercise 2.1 is also, they go through the development of the future value application, so it's on page 74 and 75 in the book. Actually 74 through 76 in the book, sorry. You can go through there. It tells you step by step how to build the future value application that appeared in this chapter. I would highly recommend that you go through it just to get the practice, and if you have any questions, feel free to email me or post in discussion boards, which I'm planning on adding if we don't have them already. I think they're already there, but perhaps not. So then we'll see what's going on next week. Next week we will be going over Chapter 3, so using HTML5 and CSS3 with ASP.NET. So we covered a lot of material today, so I recommend reading through Chapters 1 and 2 in the book, and then I will talk to you next week. So see you later. Bye-bye.